on the show today, Lucia Horan. So Lucia Horan is a very well-established Five Rhythms teacher, also Dharma teacher, mindfulness teacher, with kind of a trauma-sensitive focus, I believe. So we'll hear more about Lucia's background in a minute. But first of all, Lucia, just welcome.
Thank you.
Joining us from California today, right?
Yes, I am. I'm in Big Sur, California, and it's a beautiful day looking down the coast in Big Sur.
And I mean, your story is pretty interesting. Do you want to tell our listeners how you got interested in dance and mindfulness and the kind of thing you do now?
Yes, thank you. It's an honor to be here, Mark, and we've seen each other and looped around each other for a long time, so it's nice to have a face-to-face with you. And thank you for this invitation. So, my story is interesting in the sense that I was really born into the lineage of the Five Rhythms and into mindfulness and the human potential movement through Esalen Institute, which is and was the very first human potential center in the United States that was founded by Michael Murphy and Dick Price in the early 60s. And it's a natural hot springs, and it's also the land, the sacred land of the Esalen Indian tribe. So I was actually born on that tribal land, and my parents were a part of the original community there. My mom and dad were had a beautiful love story. My dad gave my mom her first massage, and when she came to Esalen, and at that time he was actually with Gabrielle, who was the founder of the Five Rhythms, and they had a son together, who's Jonathan, my half brother. And my mom kind of fell in love with my dad, and when Gabrielle and my father separated, my mom and dad got together, and then my sister and I were born there. We grew up in a unique way in a really beautiful place, and our mothers were very close. So we grew up inside of this community where Aldous Huxley, Fritz Perls, Gabriela Roth, Anna Halprin, many people were in the process of developing their work, and their children were around. And we were a part of the pack of kids that kind of grew up on the in the blood of all of that mixture of dance and movement and music and psychedelics and healing. And it was really that birthplace of where psychology took a turn from being a solely approach through the head and began the process of entering an era of embodied psychology where people really started to work with the body. And Gabrielle approach with her work and what she spent her entire lifetime dedicated to was understanding the human experience through movement. And my parents were a part of the Esalen massage community, so they were part of the founders, contributing founders of Esalen Massage. So all the kids in our family were raised in a really unique way around these fabulous community of leaders and developers of these kinds of healing modalities that were mostly kind of psychosomatic based. And our moms were very close, so Gabrielle and my mom were very close and really contributed to raising the kids together. So all of the kids, my brother Jonathan, Jasmine, and I got this incredible upbringing of being really steeped in the Esalen massage, the healing and bodywork aspect of being in the sacred lands and the hot springs, which sit on the edge of the cliffs, and also within the dance. So we were just around in a culture of drumming and dancing and music and healing, and that's how we were raised. And that's how I
Romantic.
landed there.
Yeah,
I was
it's
kind of just
quite a
got
place
birthed
to
into
grow up.
it.
I remember actually bumped into your half brother in California on another course 25 years ago, I think roughly now. And I didn't know what Islam was then. I was just getting into embodiment and starting sort of early days in that work. And later learned it was one of the real epicenters, one of the real birthplaces of the kind of, as you say, it's where psychology takes this turn to the body and spirituality and these other pieces. And it sounded, from what he told me, a pretty wild place to grow up. Like, can you just give like listeners a picture of that? Because it's for the person who grows up in a, I don't know, suburban neighborhood in Britain or Germany listening to this, it's a pretty different environment, right?
Yeah, okay. I'll give it a crack. So you can actually see behind me, for those of you who are watching this via video, the edge of the United States comes to Big Sur, which is in the central coast of California. And we have a very high mountain range called the Santa Lucia Mountain Range, and it's this incredibly beautiful high cliffs and ridges of mountains that come fall straight into the sea. And some people call it God's altar because it's so dramatic when you drive here and walk here and hike on the coast here. You look down hundreds of feet directly into the Pacific Ocean, the huge waves crashing. When you sit at Esalen Institute, you understand why they considered it sacred land, the tribal people here, because it's a land where there was never war was never found. You sit into these stone hot tubs, which are maybe 100 feet above the cliff, in the hot water, looking down, and whales are passing by, dolphins, there's sea otters, and often there would be people creating art, making drums, drum circles going on. Baba Olatunji, who was one of the first African drummers who came, who he made an album called The Drums of Passion. When we were kids, he used to come with his troupe and his team and teach African dance and music and drumming workshops. And so, all around us was this, just sitting on the cliffs in this beautiful area with the sun's rising and setting and no light pollution, so more stars than you've ever seen in the night sky before, and just this incredible natural setting with people coming from all over the world to develop these incredible healing modalities. That was a lot like, being there was a lot like being inside of a petri dish, experimenting with so many different modalities of healing that was really on the cutting edge, and people were pushed into working together so that they could cross cultivate their work and germinate different ways of thinking and different approaches to healing. So it was this highly potent environment, both physically, spiritually, emotionally, and then just being in the dynamic nature. So if that
Yeah, yeah.
draws somewhat of a picture for you.
Yeah, yeah, it certainly is. I hear so many things. Fritz Perls in the hot tub talking to Moshe Feldenkrais, or the kind of mixes and influences that might have been happening there. And I'm also just imagining on a very personal level. This is, as a child, to be around that. But before we will definitely talk about Five Rhythms, but it's like, that's a hell of a place for a child just to be sponging up as an atmosphere.
Yes, it was. And in some ways there was a very different, I like to call it the appropriate meter. There's now what we would consider appropriate for children to be around is pretty, there's actually a meter for it, but back then there really wasn't. So there wasn't a lot that was censored around the kids. Certain things were, there was a shadow aspect to growing up there, for
Mm,
definitely, as there is in any experience of life. People can think it's this a utopian experience,
mm,
but the reality is, there was, different things that happen, and parents not paying attention to their kids because they were experimenting and doing psychedelics and whatnot. But luckily for my family, my parents were very attentive, especially my mother, and my father was this fabulous artist. He used to play chess with Fritz Perls in the lodge and the dining room back in the day, and sit with him and talk philosophy. And you know, as a kid, we were just a it was normalized for us. So there was a small pack of kids. There weren't tons of kids. We didn't grow up going to schools with 300, 500, 1,000 kids. We went to little gazebo school, which was the preschool there, and it was teaching the kids about Gestalt languaging from a young age. So a lot of focus on feelings and understand feelings and clarity around communication. And actually, that school was kind of founded on the approach of how to work with children and apply Gestalt languaging to working with children so they could be in touch with their bodies. So a lot of things that we learned as really young kids, a lot of people come to Esalen to kind of unlearn and relearn. We were just absorbed into the field, so nothing was weird or strange. People used to ask us that question of like, what's it like when you go in the real
mm.
world? And we don't that was our real world, and it is our real world. We grew up with around a lot of adults, not around a lot of kids, and the pack of kids that were there tend to kind of run things and run things over and get in trouble a lot. But we had free range. And because we were inside of the community and there was a lot of amazing and beautiful adults around us, everyone kind of looked out for each other. So there was that aspect of it. The other aspect of being a child in a place like that was that when ceremonies were happening, we were a part of them. When Gabrielle was teaching and the whole, place was thumping with the sounds of the drums or the music she was playing, and we wanted to be there, we just walked in and we were a part of that as, little kids, 5, 4,
Mm.
like my daughter now, who's 4.5 years old, she comes into my groups there, and I really pride myself in that when it's appropriate. And um, Gabrielle kind of developed there was a time where she recognized that certain work wasn't appropriate for kids to be around. So from her perspective, she shielded us a bit. So
Mm.
in her primary maps, working with waves and just the dynamic energies, the kids were kind of always around and allowed to be around. But once people got into the heartbeat, which is like her second deeper map, which goes into the emotional intelligence work and the transformation of dynamic emotions and energies, that's where people are really externalizing their fear, their anger, their grief, their rage. And then she asked the kids to not be around. And there was a learning curve. It wasn't like a straight, no, you can't be here. There was, we were exposed to it. And she realized how much was being externalized and said, okay, this isn't the place. Kids don't need, kids are open, and we're these incredibly sensitive vessels. And so she realized that that wasn't appropriate for kids. So there was that too. There was some shielding of, hey, when people are in heavy process, the kids, and naturally kids aren't attracted to that anyway,
Mm.
kids,
Right. Right.
it's scary. It's scary and
Uh,
overwhelming.
okay. Yeah. Yeah. I had a good friend at university who went to a Steiner school, very kind of countercultural alternative school, and it sounded very ideal to me in many ways. But he was sort of relearning some things at university that were, it wasn't all sweetness and light, and that education he had, which sounded much more holistic and well-rounded and emotionally intelligent, the education I had in a normal state school mostly sounded very good, but he also seemed to he carried some baggage from it as well. And imagine there's pros and cons to anything.
Yeah, sure. And there's lots of nitty-gritty details. But yeah, I mean, mostly I think that the biggest kind of theme of the shadow of the 60s of growing up in the 70s, because I was born in 1976, was that there was this sexual revolution going on. So there was a lot of free sexuality and exploration around that. There was a lot of exploration around personal work and psychedelics, which really, when people go into that realm, it's so self-focused, they kind of don't pay attention to their kids. So around neglect and things like that. That was also an era where there was a tremendous amount of kind of cult activity, where you
Mm.
had a lot of different gurus and from Bhagwan Rajneesh to, like, many different kind of cults and different spirituality groups that were going on, where Esalen wasn't focused on one spirituality. It was really open to, Unitarian, open to everything. But sometimes people would, whether it was Eureka or whether it was, Bhagwan Rajneesh, it was, people were kind of going off into their robes and and kind of leaving their kids behind for someone else to take care of. So there's some of that. And just, I think, a lot of the exposure and, drug use really young. The thing that you are naming, though, about the shadow of like what someone has to recover from, it's interesting. I mean, I feel fortunate because I didn't have a heavy karma around any kind of abuse as a child. But I did have to relearn how to communicate in a way that wasn't so focused on myself and my own feelings, and also
Mm.
believing my own feelings. Because one of the things with an over identification of one's emotions is, which is what Gestalt language using is so focused on, is that we're so identified with that focus that we believe everything we feel. And often our feelings mislead us and put us in directions that aren't actually true. It's just fear is arising. It doesn't mean the thought around the fear is true.
Mhm.
So it wasn't until I really entered into Theravada Buddhism that I started to recognize there was needed to be a loosening around my understanding of everything that I felt wasn't necessarily true, and that the feelings are just arising, passing, and moving through me. And that was really helpful. And I felt like in some way what you're addressing in that is this unlearning of the identification of the kind of over gestalting of something, which is that over processing of then that identification that I am my feelings rather than I'm just experiencing this right now. So it was really helpful for me to actually um, learn how to work with my feelings in a different way. Um, and it's kind of the opposite what most people in Western world,
Right. Yeah.
they have to work to get in touch with their feelings, but we were so focused on the feeling I had to find a different balance, it was in the other direction.
Mhm. I'm also wondering, it's like when you started teaching, in that you have a tremendous amount of experience in that you started very young, both implicitly, just being around it in the field, as it were, and then explicitly. I think you were, was it 18 when you did the teacher training, like Gabriela Roth's, I think, if
19, yeah,
my
I was
research reminds me
19.
right, I think it was the very first one. So like,
Yeah.
how was it sort of teaching this work at quite a young age? Because most of, for example, the Five Rhythms teachers I've done, so I think, say Ginny in Brighton, she's in her 40s or 50s. Yeah, I'm curious, how was that?
It was tough, it was tough because people had a real attitude. They have an attitude about a young person who's there
Mm,
to teach them something. So I started out when I was 19, and I'd walk into a room to teach, and even though I had spent my whole life doing this work, they don't know me. I'm just a kid to them. And there was a lot of crossed arms and kind of crossed brows, furrowed brows about, well, is this kid gonna tell me, and but then once I would get started, they would they would crack and open and have an incredible experience, and but it was scary, especially for a young person to come in with that kind of attitude. It already starts against you. There's this prejudice against you because
mhm.
you're already, because you're so young, and so people didn't really understand. But once we got going and got into it, they saw very quickly that this is in my blood, this, I was born and raised, and I'm not, I wasn't messing around. So, very quickly they did. And then the advantage of teaching young was that, because I started when I was 21, so and 46 now, is, you get a lot of chops, and you learn a lot from a really young age. And I used to be really afraid every time I would walk in. I was afraid of doing, I know the higher the stakes, the more fear would arise. And I had to learn how to really face my fear and work with the courage so that I could overcome the inertia that wanted me to hold me back from showing who I am and being transparent and authentic in my teaching, and trusting that I was enough and that I didn't have to overfill every tiny little space, but trust in the method. And the moment that I would get out of the way, then let the method do the work, boom, the room just unlocked and the magic happened. And so I learned at a young age that there's this philosophy that Gabrielle holds, and also she loved Bhagwan Rajneesh, though she wasn't a devotee of Osho in the sense of she wasn't a sannyasin. She loved his teachings. And one of the things that she used to love to repeat that he said was to dance until the dancer disappears and only the dance remains. You've probably heard that. Many people have heard that very famous quote, dance until the dancer disappears and only the dance remains. And what it's alluding to is to get out of one's own way so that we can enter into the trance state, get out of the ego mind, get out of the chattering, thinking, judging mind, so that we can drop into the experience of embodied presence. And what I realized at that young age about teaching, I mean, it took a little while to get there, but is that their same philosophy applies to being a teacher, to teach until the teacher disappears and only the teaching remains. I trust so deeply in the method that was birthed, through her, that when I can get out of my ego way as a teacher and let the teaching flow through, that's when something really powerful happens. That's when the teaching comes alive. So that was one of the things that has helped me a lot as a teacher. Just keep getting out of the way.
Makes sense. I probably danced about 20 different five rhythm teachers over the years, and I always sort of noticed that the kind of newer qualified ones talk too much, for want of a more polite way of saying it. And they try and put too much in, and the really good ones kind of get out of the way. And that's what I've noticed over the years of, traveling around and dancing in different places. How does it work? So we had a small conscious dance set just a few days ago with a group in Slovenia. A Croatian teacher came along and did a little piece there. And I dance consistently. My wife and I go to the beautiful old church on Wednesday nights in Brighton. It's pretty much dance date night for us, nearly every Wednesday. Has been for the 15 years I've lived in Brighton. And it does something wonderful. Not only do I feel good, I have great ideas. It feels like things get worked through, like the next day, I'm healthier, happier, more creative, thinking more clearly. And I sort of had us jumping around to music for 2 hours to do that. And sometimes the explanations are sort of quite mystical. And I'm okay with that because, that's definitely a lens I can look through it through. But I wonder, what's your take when someone, like, particularly if someone sort of more mainstream were to say, how does this thing work? Like dancing, which is a loaded word anyway. How does it work? What would be your answer to that?
How to make a big question simple, because that is a very big question, which we could probably spend our whole time talking about. And I love that you're asking this. And I first just want to say, I love that you shared that you do this with your wife, because my husband and I met through the dance and we danced together, and I know for myself that I am a better teacher, a better mother, a better friend, and a better wife when we're dancing together. And all that just gets worked out on the dance floor. And yeah, so first, I mean, dance is a loaded word for a lot of people because there's a lot of shame in not being a good dancer, or not feeling at home in their body, or not liking their body. So often we're kind of confronted with that judgmental, critical mind, which separates us from being able to connect with it. Gabrielle, really, her approach was that this isn't really a dance, but it's not performance based, it's presence based. And when we take that out and we look at it more of as a reflection of the dance of life, a metaphor for life, it opens us up to all kinds of possibilities and opportunities for really understanding what the dance and what movement can do for a person. And I think one of the things that has happened culturally is that a lot of the value of the mind has only been understood through academia. So the academic mind is where all of the focus goes generally in Western culture. So what people don't understand though is, and what we're working with when we work with a conscious dance practice, is that Gabrielle is saying we're working with consciousness, and when you start, you're self-conscious. That's the critical, judgmental mind. But when you start practicing, consciousness changes, and that critical mind of self-consciousness becomes self-awareness. And that self-awareness opens us up and frees us and loosens the kind of contraction of the over-identification of a lot of painful things. And in the process, there's this sacred trinity which happens in the core of our teaching, is what we call the sacred trinity. And when someone consciously engages their breath, their movement, and their spirit, their energy, into one infused experience of a present moment, the critical mind has an opportunity to shift and transform into this embodied presence. And what that embodied presence does is it is it takes all the intelligence, which is usually contracted between the ears, and spreads it into the intelligence of the whole body. And then people have access to the intelligence that's running through every cell in their system. If you want to be a really powerful thinker, you want to be able to be really creative, you want to be able to be coming with new ideas and new experiences and let energy flow, you have to be able to access the entirety of our mind. Our mind is in our shoulder, our mind is in our heart, our mind is in our spine, sending billions of bits of information. Our mind is in the bare foot. That's why we dance barefoot, because when we're barefoot, it's sending and lighting up the brain and sending billions of bits of information up into the brain. And so the mind is this, the body is this extension of the academic mind. And when we can realize that and really embody that, the whole totality of our integrated nervous system, we have access to so much more intelligence, so much more information. So I think that the magic that you're talking about, like, why does this work? Why is this amazing? Why do so many people want to do this and are so blown open by it? Is because there is this source of power that we've been divorced from. And then that moment of using the simple tool of this sacred trinity and access to the system of the rhythms and the philosophy and embodiment of that, we open this door, this portal to so much more power than we've been told we have. You know, our parents, or most people's parents, not mine, but most people's parents didn't understand that. And so it's an amazing experience. And to tell you the truth, in working all over the world and working with thousands and thousands of people, the people that are the most divorced from their body, who have the hardest time breaking this down to an understanding, are the most rewarding to see access this place that you're talking about.
Makes sense.
Does that make sense?
It
What are
does.
your thoughts
Lovely.
about that?
That's like a statement. I'd rather listen to you for now. So stillness, movement is good. Movement is good. We love movement. Movement helps us think. Movement helps us be human. Movement helps us access other states. Great. You're also a Dharma teacher. You teach meditation. What do you get from one that you don't get from the other? So the movement meditation versus the sitting meditation.
So the first thing that I would say in response to that is returning to the words of the wise man of Rumi, who said, in order to truly understand stillness, we must dance. And in order to truly understand the dance, we must be still. And what that is speaking to is that there is a within the polarity of stillness and movement, they feed each other. When we get really still, we can actually experience what the dance has shifted in us. And when we move, we can really understand and come into the truth of knowing what the stillness has done for us. Now, from that teaching, we also see, and this is a deep process of my own work and the development of Gabriela's work, kind of, I would say the evolution of it, because I'm a second generation teacher, is that this amazing thing happens where the dance has this power to externalize a lot of energy and to process trauma and all kinds of different experiences that are held in the cells of our body. As Ida Rolf would say, the issues are in our tissues. And in order to have an integrated healing, we can't just approach it from the mind and the stories. We have to go into the body, into the structures of how we've been shaped. So we dance and we externalize. And what that does is it activates the nervous system. So now you've put the nervous system into its full activated state where it's releasing. And then what the stillness does is it allows the nervous system to settle, quiet, and integrate. And for me, if a teacher doesn't offer the space for that, then what I see happening is that people walk out of rooms feeling ungrounded, uncentered, and and kind of frantic and chaotic, and they're not in a centered state. So the stillness is really crucial for just allowing for that, the coming down, integrating, and quieting of the nervous system, which allows people to then take full advantage. It's a metabolizing of the dance that happens within stillness, and without it, the dance isn't fully metabolized.
Metabolize, I like that word for it. And I guess one thing that has changed a lot since you started dancing is trauma awareness. And this is part of your work. And the world didn't know that much about trauma in the 70s. It just didn't. It was just discovering it. PTSD was only a diagnosis in the 70s. And how does this add to the conscious movement world? Because it is coming in yoga, it's coming in meditation. You had David Trevelyan on the other day about meditation and trauma. I wonder how it's starting to influence the conscious dance world.
I love that you're asking this question, because more than anything in the world right now, I wish for everybody and anybody who's listening to this to be trauma informed. Because there is no way that we can be in any room, in any group of people, where trauma is not present. Now, there's a huge spectrum of trauma, and that is real. Some people are really high on the spectrum and some people are low, but there's nobody that doesn't have it. I mean, if you were born, then there was your first trauma, just being born, really. But then we have this deeper understanding now of what trauma is, where a lot of people had a very base understanding of it in the past, of what was considered an acute trauma. And that was the only trauma that people really had a relationship to understanding. Oh, you were in a car accident, you had a near-death experience, you had a terrible surgery, so on, like that. And that's the kind of thing that would, categorize, or you had a violent crime happen to you or something. That would be the kind of thing that people would just go, okay, boom, yeah, I understand that. So now there's this expanded understanding of trauma. Sorry, my dog has let himself into the room here.
Dog trauma happening in the background.
Dog trauma. So this is what it is to have a puppy, which anybody who has a dog understands. So now we have all of these different degrees, varying degrees of understanding chronic trauma, compound trauma, acute trauma. So there's a huge, wide variety of understanding. Well, what is trauma, and how did I get into the place that I am, or having a hard time functioning or being present in the world, being able to be, fully. Sorry.
You want to check on the dog?
It's out of the moment. Yeah. So one of the things that is, so I began my trauma experience out of trauma. I had a very extreme acute trauma that happened of a loss of a partner who died in a violent crime. And that brought me to working with Peter Levine. And Peter Levine's work he was the very first person to be able to actually work with PTSD in an effective way. And he wrote the book Waking Tiger, Healing Trauma. He was the revolutionary person in relationship to trauma. And now he developed somatic experiencing work. So a lot of people that do somatic experiencing, whether they're therapists or whether they're lay people, have this incredible skill of how to efficiently work with trauma and understand it through the body, what trauma does to the body. And now we have this more recent development of working with trauma, which is actually being offered to many, many thousands of people around the world, which is David Trevelyan's work, who you just mentioned. And he's one of my teachers. I've done both his introductory and his advanced courses, and he's hugely influential in my work as a teacher. And I'll tell you, if I had not been certified in trauma sensitive mindfulness, I'm already a Dharma teacher, but without that certification, I don't think that I would have been able to as effectively work with people coming out of COVID and out of the pandemic who are so traumatized, especially frontline workers. So I'm seeing a huge spectrum of people coming to me out of COVID to do mindfulness, trauma sensitive mindfulness, and five rhythms work, who are trying to process and metabolize the deep loss and grief, anger, and fear, which has been experienced through all the different variables of trauma. And so there's a lot of people that I would have otherwise lost. So in
Hmm.
students who I would have
Hmm.
otherwise lost because they didn't understand, even through my own trauma work and my own trauma healing, I had somewhat of a trauma informed, much more probably than a lot of, I think, conscious dance teachers, because I focused on it so deeply in my own personal work. But doing the TSM, trauma sensitive mindfulness training, has allowed me to really reach my arms around and embrace this community of highly traumatized individuals without losing them or without
Right,
judging
right.
them, because in that era that you're talking of, this like the early era of where it wasn't understood, there was a lot of kind of blowing people's nervous systems up and
Hmm.
dancing them for 6 hours. And I was a part of that. We were teenagers. We were, 14 years old. And yeah, we had the stamina for it. And we didn't, it didn't dysregulate us because we weren't experiencing that level of trauma. But if you're working with people who are traumatized in any way, especially that's the mid to higher end on that spectrum, and you activate their systems like that with no front loading or buffering of how to care for themselves during a practice, it's not always positive.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
they get brought into doing conscious dance, and it's like being pulled into Medusa's cave, and it's really unsafe because the body is there's been so much perpetration, there's so much woundedness, there's so much harm it's a painful place. So you throw a person like that into their body and say, okay, now pay attention to your hips, pay attention to your chest, your spine, your feet, you know they're going you're putting them direct contact with the most painful aspect of themselves that pushes them into either dissociation or overwhelm, and it completely dysregulates them. So
Hmm.
there's part of trauma sensitive mindfulness is, and within the Dharma work, mindfulness work, it's really important to understand when is the practice benefiting a student and when is it not. When would it be better for that person to go get a different kind of help? And rather than having it be a judgment or I'm kicking you out of this class, it's an invitation and an explanation of, hey, this is something you need to probably go and address with a trauma professional first. Do some work to heal, and then you'll be able to come in and be in a more friendly relationship with the movement practice and have it be really beneficial. So a lot
Yeah.
of people that are in work, so my work is trauma informed, but I'm not a therapist, so I'm not a trauma professional. So for some people, I say, hey, if you can be in here and it's if beneficial for you, great. But you might also want to be working with a trauma professional at the same time. So that's one thing. The other is like, how do we hold? We used to look at Gabrielle had a term in the shadow side of lyrical, which is being, she called it spaced out. So in the fourth rhythm, lyrical, the essence of it is a transformative quality, and the shadow side of it is this unfocused, dissociative, divided attention, a place where a lot of people relate to in this day and age. But when we go too far into dissociation, there was just back in the day this judgment of, oh, you can't be present, you can't be with us, you're spaced out, you're a spacey person. And now they're always going in and out of the room, they can't handle it, they're overwhelmed. And now what we understand is with trauma sensitive mindfulness is, hey, if you're going into overwhelm or dissociation, we actually encourage you to take a break. We encourage you to step outside. We encourage you to open or close your eyes, use one of the shields. There's 5 shields:
Right.
deep belly breath, change position, open, close the eyes, that kind of thing, where they can stay in their window of tolerance and regulate their system so that every part of that dance is beneficial for them and that they have the agency. Because in trauma, people lost agency. They lost the ability to have choice because something happened to them that wasn't in their choice. So what we're trying to do in trauma recovery work is to give people a choice back. every exercise we do, you have a choice, engage or don't. This music works or doesn't, step in or step out. You have the agency. Nothing is happening to you. You are in charge. And Gabrielle's work was very focused on that. Like, take back the relationship. You are the guru, you are in charge. That's a part of that sense of agency, is to take back that power. So I think those aspects are really important for us as for anyone who's listening to this, who's a conscious dance teacher. I encourage you to read David Treleaven's book, to do his training, to really deepen your understanding of what it means to be trauma informed, because you'll be able to help so many more people.
Yeah, when I see someone new arrive to a meditation class, or like, standing outside the church on a Wednesday night, and I'm like, you're coming in, I kind of feel like this is something really precious, and it's hard enough to go to the first time anyway, like particularly something that's not so, Five Rhythms isn't as well known as yoga in the UK, for example. It just isn't. So people are already crossing a threshold when they go to that class, and they can maybe hear the music, and there's people dressed funny jumping around barefoot, and I think it's so precious, and I don't want to kind of give them an overwhelming experience when it could be titrated, to use Peter Levine's word. There's some calibration, some choice, a bit more consent culture. I feel the kind of conscious dance world is catching up, if I'm honest, to yoga and meditation, which were catching up to therapy and kink, which were well ahead of the game. But it seems to be getting there now. There's some catching up happened, and I definitely recommend David. I don't think he'd mind me saying he's a friend, and my entire team have a crush on him as well for some reason. They all love him. So I think he's very gentle, and that's very appealing to them. So, David, if you're out there, my entire team fancies you. But yes, so good to hear that's coming in. And you do women's work as well, right? With dance, that's one of your areas.
It is. It's one of my areas. It's a work that I call Moon Lodge, and Moon Lodge is for women of all ages and also those who identify as women. So it's not necessarily a born into the gender situation, but it's really for everyone who identifies as a woman. And the work is really profound. I started doing women's work, and I just looked around the room and said to myself, Jesus, this is so loaded. We are so loaded. There is so much work to be done here. And that work is in relationship to our own bodies, to our own perpetrations and healings that needs to take place. It's also in relationship to the earth and our relationship to the mother. It's relationship to sister, daughter, auntie, mother, friends. And there's something that very magical that happens, and very supportive that happens when women gather together, or men for that matter. My husband runs men's groups. When we come together as one to unify, my belief is that there are things that are too big to be held alone. And those things are the things that the group or the Sangha can hold together. That which is too big to be held alone can be held together. And so there's a larger piece of what happens when we gather in that way. And so the women's work that I do is comprised of the movement aspect, which is the five rhythms, but also within mindfulness and the trauma sensitive mindfulness. And then there's a third component, which is very important to the women's circle, and that is something called the way of counsel. And the way of counsel is a Buddhist practice that is a very simple and clean process where one engages in compassionate sharing and authentic listening in the larger circle of being held, and that is very profound for people to come forward and speak their truth or say the things that they're working with, and share and be held without trying to be fixed or counseled or given advice, but just the deep appreciation for the practice of listening, to be with someone when they're listening without trying to change you. So the counsel work is something that I hold as a very sacred space to the circle of doing women's work. And part of the women's work is also has to do with just the education and coming back to the body and understanding ourselves and rites of passage, archetypes, things that have been kind of divorced from our Western culture that really are cultural wounds. They end up being cultural wounds that there are a lot of shame around. So when we look at the archetypes, five Buddha houses, we look at the mandala of the empowered feminine, rites of passage and how to create rites of passage, and spiritual baths and things like that. It's so wonderful and inspiring. I feel so passionate to be with women who are doing this kind of work in the world. And our hope is, because I work with Dr. Julie Vaughn a lot in the Moon Lodge work, and also in the another specialized group called Spiritual Fertility, which is for women who are working with infertility issues, that within that group, our goal was not just that we want to teach this, but we want to see women go out and share this in their communities, in their homes, with their children, with their friends, even in small circles. So there's a larger mission impact that we have in the vision of doing Moon Lodge work in the world right now. So yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, before we sort of send people to your website and things, I'm going to indulge myself if you don't mind. Would you mind if I shared a little dance story that's happened to me recently? Because I think it speaks to some of the magic
Please,
of this work.
please.
So I'm in Portugal, a bit burnt out. I've been in Ukraine, working in Ukraine around trauma stuff, and we do dance there. But it was, I was pretty burnt out, and I had a kind of bit of hate in my heart, particularly towards Russians, because I heard a lot of nightmare stories and getting bombed and things. And I know that wasn't really logical, and it was against my spiritual beliefs in many ways, but these things can get lodged. And it was kind of making me sick, like physically sick. And like we were starting to get heart problems and things. So I went to dance in the woods in Portugal, nice environment, kind of, Esalen level beauties. And there's a good teacher there that was holding the space. I knew it would be good. And it was contact dance, but kind of, with music, so that kind of conscious dance element. And the first night before we did the introductory circle, I was dancing. I was just really drawn to someone on the dance floor. And we had this like hour-long, playful, flirty, awesome dance together for an hour. And after the dance, we sat down to introduce ourselves the first night for the retreat. And we went round, and I'd said before, you know what, if there's any Russians there, I'm not going to dance with them. I'm going to try and be polite, but I won't dance with them. And we went around the circle, and everyone introduced himself. And me and this young woman were the last two people. And she introduced herself, and she had a Russian name, a Russian accent. And I just burst into tears because I couldn't hate her by that. I'd already had this wonderful human bodily love connection. And we spent 2 days dancing with each other, worked something through, and then that was that. And came away from it both sort of feeling much better about ourselves and the world, and able to go back and do the work we need to do. And there was something in that I just thought, wow, there is something a bit special that happens on the dance floor, something a bit magical, even no matter how sort of logical and looking at trauma theories and this and that. And yeah, I hope you don't mind my indulgence in sharing that little story, but it struck me as a magic moment.
I love that you shared that story, and it actually touches on one of the core components of the council work, because when you look to cultivate compassion, you might go in with deep anger in your heart, and often where there's anger, not just the individuals hurting, but many people are hurting. And your story exemplifies what happens when we go in with a story in our head and the judgmental mind. The second we walk into the room, we immediately make up stories about everybody. It's just kind of part of the territory. And then you have this connection with people. And then later you find out their story. And the most humbling part of it is we're often wrong. Our stories are often wrong. And it shows you what the mind does to generate protection and fear. And when we look to really cultivate compassion, one of the things that compassion rests on is connection. And so in order to cultivate that compassion, which you did with that woman, and also towards yourself and towards the Russians, there are many Russians who have done terrible things, but there are many, many more who are really hurting, who have lost their children, and all of the rational reasons. But you danced through it, and you saw your story, and then you had this incredible connection, and you got to see where you were able to move right through it. I love that. I love that story. I think that's so beautiful, and that's one of the reasons why I think we work to cultivate compassion more. And in the council work, when we dance together, it's not a lot of talking, so we're dancing, dancing, dancing. Days go by. We have all these stories about each other, And I'll tell you one humbling story of my own that's kind of similar. Is that often the students that I would have the hardest time with, that I would internally as a teacher feel the most triggered by, um, because of their dissociative behavior, when I sat down in council work and would listen to their story, or I would go to them privately and say, "Tell me what's going on," instead of judging them and walking away or writing them off, their stories were so heartbreaking. And instead of separating myself as a teacher, I want to ask more. And so when I have those kind of red flags with people, or I feel that kind of judgment or hatred or anger or charge happen, instead of following the patterning of of distancing and separating, now I use that as an opportunity to ask questions and to really hear, because I've been so humbled by moments like that where I made up a story and found that I was very wrong, and that person was probably the person who was hurting the most in the entire room because of what they had lived through.
Lucia, I think it's a beautiful place to end. I need to run. Where do people find you on the internet? It's luciahoran.com, right? Simple as that.
It is. It's luciahoran.com or somaticmeditation.com. So you can
Somatic
find me
Medicine.
at either of those.
And that's LuciaHoran for November. So, Lucia, it's really nice to actually connect with you, because you've spoken at events and we've had communication, but it's taken us a while. So I'm glad we made it. So yeah, nice to talk with you today.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor to be here.